guys, it's Letty, and welcome to another episode of Beneath the Sandalwood Tree. Today, we're not talking about a mystery with a twist ending. We're talking about a cold, hard fact. A 17-year-old girl named Marsela went to do a daily chores one afternoon and never came home. She was a second-grade student at West Kupang State High School, a girl with a simple life and a family who loved her, in the village of Onisu. But on February 24th, 2021, her world ended in a patch of bushes, her life stolen by a man named Justinus Taniam. The question isn't who did it. The question is, how did a quiet, ordinary Tuesday afternoon become the final chapter of a young girl's life? That's how it started. Not with a plan, not with a dark room and a grand scheme, but with a pen and a pad of paper. Tinas, a man with a mind like a junkyard dog, sat down and scribbled a bunch of phone numbers. He didn't know who they belonged to, didn't care. It was a game of chance, a spin of the wheel. He called the numbers one by one, a cold, mechanical process. The dial tone was a blank, empty sound, a promise of nothing. But then, one of the numbers answered, and on the other end was a voice, a girl's voice, a voice that belonged to a life Tinas didn't know and would soon take. It was a simple, stupid beginning, the kind of randomness that makes you wonder if there's a devil in the details, or just a whole lot of nothing waiting for something terrible to happen. The cheap phone in her hand buzzed to life. A small, unremarkable interruption in a quiet evening. "Who is this?" Marsela asked, her voice a little hesitant. The man on the other end, a stranger, a ghost from a random scribble, said his name was Tinas. She didn't know him. Her mind, a map of familiar faces and names, didn't have a place for him. "Where did you get my number?" she asked. A reasonable question from a girl who had no idea how random the world could be. His answer, a cold, honest, "I called it randomly," was a small, unsettling ripple in the calm surface of her life. It was a detail so small and so ordinary that it was easy to dismiss. But a moment like that, a random call from a stranger, is where the trouble often begins. A week went by, a handful of days that felt like a lifetime to a man like Tinas, and a blip on the radar for a girl like Marsela. Her phone logged a missed call to his number, an accident, a small, innocent finger slip that would set everything in motion. He called back, his voice a disembodied echo, and she confirmed it. "Where do you live?" he asked. A simple question that felt like a slow tightening of the knot. She gave him her address, the name of a village and a church nearby, a familiar landmark that was a part of her world. She even agreed to meet, a small, trusting gesture, but she insisted it had to be close to home. The caution was there, a faint flickering light in the dark, but it wasn't enough to stop what was coming. Marsela said yes. It was a simple word, a short, trusting exhale that sealed her fate. She was a kid who probably had a dozen other things she was supposed to do that day. A stack of homework, maybe a chore her mother had asked her to do. But for some reason, she said yes to a stranger she'd never met. A guy who had found her with a flick of his wrist. 3 days went by and Tinas's text came in. a short, cold message to set the time and place. She agreed. The meeting spot, a place as familiar as the back of her hand, right near the El Soda Tanalico Church. It was a building she'd seen 100 times, a place that was supposed to stand for something safe, something good. She had no idea she was walking toward the last sacred place she'd ever see. They met by the church, just as she had asked. He introduced himself as Tinus, a name that felt as plain and uninteresting as a lump of clay. She said her name was Putri, a small, quiet lie that was probably meant to keep a piece of herself safe. They sat on a low wall, the afternoon sun warm on their backs, the air still and heavy with the scent of dust and silence. Marsela, or Putri, as she called herself, was a girl who carried herself with a shy confidence, the kind that comes from knowing who you are, even if no one else does. She had a small, almost imperceptible tear in the sleeve of her shirt, a tiny imperfection that spoke of a real, lived life, a life full of small human details. They talked for a while, a strange, awkward dance between a girl who was trying to be polite and a man who was already a predator. Their two worlds, so different, intersecting in a place that was supposed to be holy. 10 times they met. 10 times a girl named Marsela, or Putri, met a man named Tinus, a random scribble on a piece of paper who had become a regular part of her life. The meetings were probably as mundane as a bus stop conversation, a quiet exchange of words that meant little on the surface. But each time was another turn of a key, another link in a chain that was growing tighter around her. She had a life outside of this, a life of homework and friends and simple, ordinary things. Maybe she had a favorite snack she'd buy from a street vendor, or a song she hummed to herself on the way to school. Those were the details that made her real, the small moments that Tinus had no part in and no interest in. For him, each meeting was a step closer to an inevitable conclusion. For her, it was just another afternoon, another casual conversation. The difference was only one of them knew how the story was going to end. For all their 10 meetings, they talked on the phone, a strange, disembodied relationship built on a random number. But on February 2nd, 2021, the game changed. Tinus got on Facebook, a cold, calculated move to get closer. He created a fake account, a ghost in the machine, named Yufin the Black Sweet. Marsela, or Putri, was there too, under a name she probably thought was clever and private, Putri Sulang. They started messaging each other, their words appearing on a screen, small, silent lines of text that didn't have a voice or a face. This was a new kind of trap, a digital web that didn't have to follow the rules of the real world. In this new world, he could pretend to be anyone he wanted. And she was just a girl with a profile picture, a person stripped down to a few pixels, and a secret she didn't know she was telling. Two days later, the trap began to spring. Tina sent a message, a simple request for her phone number. He lost her number because his old phone number was blocked. He was a ghost trying to find a new skin, a new way to reach her. It was a small, ordinary-sounding lie, the kind of excuse a normal person might make. But it wasn't normal. he was losing a way to get to her and needed another. Marsela, or Putri, a girl who saw a friend in a profile picture and a name, didn't think twice. She sent him her number, a string of digits that was supposed to be a bridge between two people. She had no idea it was a link in a chain that would drag her into the darkness. A simple act of trust that would become a nail in her own coffin. A day passed and the messages grew bolder. Pictures. They were traded back and forth, digital handshakes in the dark. He sent her a photo of himself, a blurry, unremarkable shot of a man who looked like 100 other men. She sent one back, a simple portrait, her face framed by her hair, her eyes holding a faint, shy smile. It was a photo that had probably been taken with a friend, a quick, unthinking shot that was meant to be shared with someone she trusted. She had no idea she was giving a piece of herself, a small, intimate window into her life, to a man who had no business seeing it. He was a ghost, a name on a screen. And with every photo, he was getting closer. His face no longer a blank slate, his world no longer just a scribble of numbers on a piece of paper. The girl was real now, and that was all that mattered to him. Two days after they had traded pictures, Tynus came to her with a proposition. He invited her to meet, a simple request with a dirty hook. He'd give her a cell phone, he said. He had two. It was a lie. A simple bait and switch that he'd probably used a dozen times on a dozen other people. She said no, a quick, firm refusal that came from a place of good sense and self-preservation. But he was relentless. He promised they'd go to the electronics store together, just the two of them, to pick out a new phone. It was the kind of offer a girl who had a phone with a cracked screen or a dying battery would find hard to refuse. It was a small detail, a promise of something better, a little piece of light in a dark world. It was enough to get her to say yes. The deal changed on February 14th. A day people sent flowers and talked about love. Tynus didn't have any of that on his mind. He laid out the terms, plain and ugly. The cell phone was still on the table, a plastic promise, but now there was a price on it. A demand delivered over a simple text message. He said what he wanted. He wanted to kiss and touch her breasts. A cold, blunt request that made the screen of her phone feel like a window into a dark room. She read the words, their meaning as clear and sharp as a broken bottle. She could have said no, could have hung up the call and thrown the phone into the street, but for some reason, she said yes. A simple, short agreement to meet the next day. It wasn't a bargain she made. It was a surrender. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a little before 4, and the sun was a hot, white thing in the sky. They met, just like they had agreed. Tynus didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He took what he wanted, a dirty kiss that was more of a violation than a greeting. When he reached for more, a hand on her shirt, she fought back. It was a quick, desperate struggle, a flailing of arms and legs, a small, stubborn refusal in a world that was already giving way. He shoved her and she fell hard, her back hitting the dirt with a dull thud. He was on top of her in a second, a dead weight she couldn't move, and then the knife was out. its blade a cold, silver threat against the blue sky. He told her he'd kill her. She didn't believe him. Or maybe she did and didn't care. She grabbed his arm, her fingers wrapping around his wrist, her hand on the blade, a small, furious rebellion that earned her a thin, red line of a cut across her palm. The cut on her hand was a fine red line that healed over time, but the fear didn't. It stayed with her, a cold lump in her stomach, a constant reminder of a Tuesday afternoon and a man who was more than just a name. Tinas kept calling. He kept sending messages. She said no, a simple, firm refusal that came from a place of good sense. But he was relentless. His words were a low, steady hum, a promise that the last time was a mistake, a moment of bad judgment he regretted. He swore it wouldn't happen again, a lie as old as time, a dirty trick from a man who had no intention of keeping it. He was a fisherman with a broken line, and all he needed was a moment of weakness to get her back in the water. That's when he changed the game again. The promise wasn't just a new phone anymore. It was a phone and 1,000,000 rupiah, a bribe laid out in plain sight. He sent the message on February 17, a couple of days after her last refusal. He was a salesman, and the product was a lie. The money was a dirty hook, a shiny object to distract from the truth. 1,000,000 rupiah. It was a fortune to a high school girl from a small village. It was a sum that could fix a lot of problems. For her, it was probably a glimpse of a different future, a way out of something, a way to get something she wanted, something she needed. He didn't know what she wanted, didn't care. He just knew what he wanted. He knew what every person wants, to want something enough to get them to do something stupid. It was a small, greedy seed he planted, and he knew it was a lie from the very beginning. It was February 23rd, and the money and the phone were no longer the only things on the table. Tinas had been talking to her for weeks, a slow, methodical chipping away at her resolve. But the remarks he sent over the phone this time were excessive. The bribe was still there, but now it came with a new set of demands, a list of things he wanted to do, things a 17-year-old girl in a high school uniform had no business hearing. The messages were ugly and blunt. He wasn't even pretending anymore. She fought back with silence and small refusals, but a man like him doesn't take no for an answer. He kept pushing, and a girl can only take so much. She finally gave in, a single, quiet word of agreement that was not consent, but an act of surrender. She walked into the house around 1:30, the afternoon sun a warm weight on her shoulders. She went to her room and came back out with her phone in her hand. Her mother was there, a quiet, reassuring presence in the middle of a life that was about to turn ugly. "I'm going to the pasture," she said. The words were a simple lie, a half-truth she had to tell to get out the door. Her mother said nothing, a quiet nod that gave her permission. Marsela walked out the door, the hot, dry air of the pasture waiting for her. She had a cow to tend to, but it was just an excuse. The truth was, there was a man waiting for her, a man with a phone to give and a price to collect. She walked into a field of tall grass, her life a simple lie that was about to get complicated. She was going to meet a man she had been talking to for a long time, and her mother would never see her again. He got there first, as planned. The sun was a dull white eye in the sky, and the afternoon air hung heavy and still. He sat on the grass, waiting, a man with nothing but a plan and a pocket full of trouble. She arrived not long after, a splash of color against the dry, brown earth. She didn't hesitate. She walked right up and sat down in front of him, her flower shirt a strange, innocent contrast to the quiet malice of the field. There were no pleasantries, no small talk. He got right to it. A low, cold request that had nothing to do with a phone or a million rupiah. He wanted to have sex with her. She didn't want to. She shook her head, a small, final act of defiance. The kind of quiet refusal that some men just don't know how to take. He kept at it, his words a slow, steady rain that wore down her final resistance. Her first no had been a small, stubborn thing, but this time, after the minutes had crawled by, she had nothing left to give. She gave in. The sun beat down on them, the tall grass a green wall that hid them from the world. He got what he wanted, a victory that tasted like dust and shame. But the game wasn't over, not for him. In the middle of it, a cold, sharp feeling hit him like a slap in the face. He felt someone's eyes on him, a silent stare from the tree line. He stopped, his head snapping up, his gaze searching the empty spaces, a predator suddenly afraid he was prey. The fear hit him, a cold, hard dose of reality. He wasn't afraid of the girl. He was afraid of the law. He was afraid of what a man gets for a crime like this, especially when the victim is a minor. He had to clean up the mess. The solution was simple. His right hand went to her throat, a brutal final act of silencing. He squeezed as hard as he could, the last bit of air rattling in her lungs, the last bit of fight leaving her body. When she was quiet, the silence a heavy thing between them, he pulled the knife he always carried. He stabbed her once in the stomach, a quiet, wet sound that was lost to the wind. Then he stabbed her again, this time in the neck, a final, brutal punctuation mark on a story that was now over. He checked. There was no breath, no movement, a simple fact. The job was done. He got to his feet, a man who had just finished his business. He took the phone from her pocket, the cheap plastic device, a final prize for his work. He slipped it into his jacket, a small, unremarkable action that felt as normal as any other. He looked around, the tall grass a silent wall, the afternoon sun a warm, unblinking eye. The air was clear. He felt safe. Then he walked away, leaving her there, a girl who had gone to the pasture to tend to a cow. He left her in the middle of the grass field, a final, brutal truth hanging in the air. The file on the desk was a dry, official thing, full of dates and numbers that told a story without emotion. The birth certificate was in there, a piece of paper that said her name was Marsela and she was born on May 19, 2003. She was a kid, a fact that the world had a hard time digesting. At the time of her death in a field on a Tuesday afternoon, she was 17 years and 9 months old. She was too young to vote, too young to know the kind of ugly that lives in the world, and too young to have a story that ended the way hers did. She was just a girl, a name on a piece of paper, and a body left behind. Her life a promise that was broken before it could even begin. Marsela's body was found the next day. The sun was up, the world was back to its ordinary business, but the patch of bushes was anything but. A simple, everyday discovery, a body in the tall grass, told a story that was anything but simple. Her clothes were open, a final public violation. Her body was marked with wounds, a brutal, silent confession that was clearer than any words. The investigators came and went, men in uniforms who saw a dozen things a day they wished they hadn't. They took pictures, measured distances, and wrote things down in notebooks. They looked at the clothes, the wounds, the way her body was laid out. They saw a victim. But for the world, for anyone who cared to look, it was a reminder that some stories don't have a happy ending. Some stories just stop. That's how it works. A call comes in, and the machinery starts turning. The body was found, the report was filed, and the orders came down the line. A team from the mobile detective unit, the Jataras, was sent to back up the local cops. 4 days. That's all it took for the first pieces to fall into place. They didn't have much to go on, just a body in a field and a feeling in their gut that this wasn't just some random act. They started pulling at threads, talking to people, looking for the last time she was seen, and a story began to take shape. They found a woman in Fatuli village who remembered a girl named Yuliani, a quiet kid with a quick laugh and a shy smile, leaving her boarding house on a Friday afternoon. She was carrying a bag and a purse, a normal girl on a normal errand. The woman remembered the time, the color of her shirt, the way she had waved goodbye, all the small, unimportant details that, in the cold light of a murder investigation, suddenly meant everything. They got him on May 21 in the Kalapalima area of Kupang City, a patch of land Tunis thought was his free territory. The Mobile Investigation Unit, the Jotunras, found him, a man who thought his luck would last forever. It didn't. He tried to run, a final, desperate dash. They put a stop to it with 2 shots, a brutal punctuation mark on a story that was already written. He went down hard, the pavement a cold bed, his freedom a puddle of blood on the street. It was a fair trade, the police thought, a small piece of justice for a man who had taken a life. But the truth was, it wasn't enough. No amount of pain could bring back the quiet life of a girl who had once left her boarding house with a wave and a smile. A girl whose story had ended in a field, and a man whose brutal end was a cold, hard fact. He talked, not with remorse, but with the cold, flat tones of a man giving a laundry list. He confessed to 2 murders and to the rape of 3 other girls, 5 victims in all. He didn't hide it, didn't try to twist it into something it wasn't. The logic was as simple and brutal as a rock. He killed the 2 because they had fought back. The other 3, the ones who were still breathing, they had given in. He said he didn't kill them because they didn't resist. That was the whole story, the full confession. For him, their survival was just a matter of compliance, a cold, apathetic detail. He was a man who lived by a simple rule. You get what you want, and if they fight, you take what you want and you get rid of the evidence. Aris Tanasib, his lawyer, was just doing his job. The police had given him the file, a cold, dry document that said a man needed representation. But the people outside the courtroom didn't care about legal obligations. They saw a man defending a monster, and they treated him like one, their scorn as sharp as any knife. They shunned him in the streets. A quiet, public verdict that was louder than any judge's gavel. But Tynes found his own kind of justice too. Inside the walls, in the hard silence of a cell, he met other men who had their own code of conduct. They didn't care about legal jargon or life sentences. They knew what he'd done to a young girl, and they gave him a verdict of their own. A brutal, unofficial punishment delivered with fists and boots. It wasn't in the court's record, but it was written all over his face. He'd gone looking for trouble, and he finally found it, not in a field of tall grass, but in a world where some crimes are too ugly for the law to handle. It came down in January of 2022, in a courtroom in Yuliani. The building was just a building, a place where people in black robes said words that changed lives. The prosecutor had asked for the death penalty, a final, brutal justice for a final, brutal crime. But the judge had other ideas. The gavel came down, and Tynes was handed a sentence of life imprisonment. He was a man who had taken 2 lives, and his punishment was to live, to breathe the same air and see the same sun, even if it was from behind bars. The court had called it premeditated murder, child abuse, and rape, citing Article 340 of the Indonesian Criminal Code and a law on child protection. They had put a name and a number to the crime, but they couldn't give back the life of a girl who had been 17 years and 9 months old. He would live, but she wouldn't. The appeal went to the Kupang High Court, another round in a legal game that had already been decided. Tynes, a man who had no use for rules, put his life in the hands of a system he didn't understand. The paperwork moved from one desk to another, and the words were weighed and measured. On April 12th, 2022, the verdict came down, a dry, official confirmation that nothing had changed. The life sentence from the Yuliani District Court was upheld. There was no victory, no surprise, just the final cold fact that the law, for all its complexities, had come to the same conclusion. His life was finished, sealed in a record, but the sentence was a small, cold comfort for the 2 lives that were. They were still gone. Their stories, a final thing. His, for all its brutality, was still being written, just behind a different kind of wall. The game wasn't over. Tynes took his case to the highest court in the land, a final, desperate gamble for a man who had already lost everything but his life. He was a ghost in the system, a man hoping for a loophole, a legal technicality that would let him breathe another day. But the Supreme Court of the Republic of Indonesia saw things differently. They looked at the files, the facts, the dry, brutal evidence of a young life stolen in a field, and they decided that life wasn't enough. The highest court had the final say, and they handed down a new verdict, a sentence that was as final as the silence in a grave. They gave him the death penalty. It was a cold, hard truth, a verdict that was meant to be a final justice for Yuliani and Marsela, two girls who had been too young to die, and a final word on a story that should have never been told. He was in the maximum security block now, a cage for the kind of animal that needs to be kept on a short leash. Kupang's city prison was his new address, a place with high walls and cold concrete that held men who had done the kind of things that earned them more than 15 years. The Supreme Court had spoken, and their words were a final, official death sentence. So he sat there, a man with a past that was a stain on the world. And he counted the days. He counted them down to 0, a grim, silent tally of the time he had left. It was a cold, small irony that his life was being measured out, one day at a time, while the lives of the two girls he had left behind in the tall grass were already over. They had no days left to count, and he, for all his terror, had nothing but. He sat in a cage, a man with a life sentence and an appointment with death, and for all his cold calculations, he hadn't seen this coming. He was a man who lived in a world of simple truths and ugly solutions. He saw other people not as lives, but as obstacles, and a murder was just a final, brutal solution to a problem. The real monster wasn't a shadow in the night or a phantom in the bushes. It was a man who looked ordinary, who rode a borrowed motorbike, and who held a grudge against the world. His life would end in a quiet room, but there was nothing quiet about the way he'd taken theirs. For all his counting of days, Marsela Bajas and Yuliani Welkes had been counting their last seconds, a simple, final terror he would never understand. That's where we leave Tinas, a ghost in a concrete box. This is Letty, from Beneath the Sandalwood Tree. The story of Tinas is a bitter lesson, a reminder that some men are just bad, a simple, ugly truth that the world tries to complicate. Their evil isn't a complex mystery, it's a cold, transactional thing that leaves a path of devastation behind it. We tell these stories not to glorify the killers, but to remember the victims and to ensure their names are spoken. If you found this case as chilling as we did, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss future episodes, and as always, leave your comments below with your thoughts on this brutal crime. Your support helps us continue to shine a light on the darkness.